to turn hard, nutrient-dead dirt into fine soil. Gophers, etc. All those varmints that want to eat your yummy vegetables can be very discouraging to a gardener. With a raised bed, you can attach hardware cloth to the bottom to discourage them. And raised beds are easy access and handicap accessible. Since they're raised up higher than the soil, these beds require less stooping, kneeling, etc. You also don't have to tromp through the mud to harvest. For handicapped gardeners, raised beds can be built to be easily accessed by people in wheelchairs, or even raised higher so someone can stand to work in them. They can be made narrower so all plants are easily reached. You can also build a seat around the edges. Betty will now show you how to construct a raised bed.
So we have a lot, our garden is all clay, and we spent a long time trying to really get it to be more user-friendly. And we finally decided to do some raised beds and see if that worked better. So we built 2 4-by-6-foot beds. I wanted them higher. I didn't want them way down at ground level. So we decided to build them with 2 panels of 8 inches each. So it doubled the sides to 16 inches. For each box, we used 4 2-inch by 8-inch by 10-foot boards of untreated Douglas fir. You can also use pine or cedar. Just be sure it's untreated so chemicals don't leach into your soil. Then we cut each piece into 4-foot and 6-foot lengths. And then we cut 4-by-4 wood into 4 16-inch lengths for the inside corners of each box. We drilled wood screws to secure each corner, and that was really exciting for me because I'd never done that before. By the end of building these, I felt like a pro almost. Finally, we laid down hardware cloth, you can see that in the bottom, and stapled it to all sides. It's probably easier to staple the hardware cloth on first and then just turn the box upside down and set it in your soil. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, Pam.
I'm trying.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. Okay.
There was one more. There was one that just showed the finished. There it is. There's the finished product with plants inside, beautifully growing. And that's it. Thanks, Pam.
Okay, there are some things to think about when you're using raised beds. First of all, bed liners. As I mentioned before, it's a good idea to attach 1/4-inch hardware cloth to the bottom of a raised bed, and you can see that in Betty's slides. This is not actual cloth, but made out of metal. I also like to line the inside of my beds with ground or weed cloth. That keeps the soil from sifting through the cracks. Soil. Bagged raised bed soil is available. I've used it in the past, but I wasn't really that happy about the results. Many landscape type businesses will sell soil by the quarter, half, or full yard, which can be more cost effective and also let you decide what type of mixture you would like. You do have to shovel it out of the back of your pickup, however. If you need a lot of soil, they will also deliver to your home, usually for an extra charge. Water. It's important to keep the soil in your raised beds moist. In the past, I've had it go hydrophobic, which means the water pretty much stays on top of the soil and it doesn't soak through. By keeping it moist, you can avoid this problem. Because the beds are raised, the soil will tend to dry out faster than ground soil. Space saving. Beds can be made to any size. I particularly like a 3-by-6-foot bed. I can reach into the center from both sides. But I also have smaller nooks and less room next to a sidewalk, so I have 2-by-2 beds and 2-by-6 beds. Depth. If you're not worried about stooping or kneeling, the depth of your beds could depend on what you plan on growing. 12 inches deep is good. I have one bed that's 18 inches deep. I first put in some straw and partially decomposed compost and then filled the rest in with soil. You'll probably need to add some soil or compost each year in order to keep the depth. I recently purchased a half yard of soil, which was enough to replenish my 5 beds. Here are some more examples of raised beds. You can see the first 2 are deeper than the third. Also shown is another space-saving idea, trellises. They can be fancy, as in the middle photo, or just a leftover chain link gate. Both of these allow your crop to grow upward. The middle trellis held lots of cucumbers. The gate on the right held cantaloupe vines. The melons held on until they were ripe. If you grow larger cantaloupes or larger fruit, you can make a sling out of strips of old t-shirts and tie them to the gate for support. Raised beds don't have to be made of wood. This old bathtub can hold all sorts of plants and a few golf balls from the neighboring course. Raised beds can also make good neighbors. Two homeowners constructed this extensive raised bed along their fence line, complete with trellis. Another homeowner used old garage panels to construct his raised beds. On to container gardening. Things to think about with containers. Containers have to have drainage. Roots sitting in water will eventually rot and die. Check the drainage holes a couple of times a year because I've had roots of roses grow through and block the drainage. Movable. An advantage of containers is they are movable, but think ahead if you plan on moving them on a regular basis. Smaller containers can be easily picked up, but they can get pretty heavy if they're full of wet soil. If you have large containers, you can always place them on casters. Water. As in raised beds, soil in containers dries out quickly. Plan to check the soil often. Drip irrigation is an easy way to keep them hydrated. Size. With size, I'm not only talking about the size of the container, but also the size of the plant. How large will this plant grow? Will you need to repot at some point? Or do you want to start with a large container the plant can grow into? These containers can be pretty expensive, so you really need to consider the eventual size of your plant so you don't have to keep purchasing bigger and bigger containers. Many items can be used as containers for your plants. An old pot, a rusty Dutch oven, fancy store-bought ceramics. Small terracotta pots can be used for fairy gardens, a fun way to get your kids or grandkids interested in gardening. This fairy garden originally had plants, but winter took care of them. My friend Rich loves to weld imaginative creatures. This mermaid's hair is a draping plant. In the same yard, an old ice chest is overrun with plants, while the old-fashioned ashtray on the right is a great place for a pot. Raised beds and containers can be a rewarding way to grow in the home garden. They both provide easy accessibility and convenience. They can be utilitarian, they can be whimsical, they can be practical or decorative, and they often reflect the personality of the gardener. Whichever you choose, happy gardening. Betty will now tell you about another space saver, square foot gardening.
Okay, thanks, Pam. So I'm going to be talking about square foot gardening today. And first off, you might be wondering, what is a square foot garden? Square foot gardening was actually invented by Mel Bartholomew in 1976 after he saw how wasteful and labor-intensive row gardening was. He had a community garden, and his fellow gardeners usually justified it as being the way we've always done it. But since Mel was an engineer and an efficiency expert, he knew there had to be an alternative. So he focused on planting, spacing, weed control, and soil, and published his first edition of Square Foot Gardening in 1981. He called it square foot gardening because you build your garden in a series of squares, each with different vegetables, fruits, herbs, flowers. How many you can put in each square foot depends on the plant and what spacing is recommended on each seed packet. So using the square foot method, you can stretch out your harvest over time and have a year-round supply of food. Mel founded the Square Foot Gardening Foundation in 1996 to pursue his mission of teaching people how to grow nutritious food with limited space and resources, and thereby be a part of solving world hunger. So why a square foot garden? What are the basic principles of square foot gardening? Why do it? Here are a few reasons. The square foot gardening method saves gardeners time. You have few, if any, weeds, and you're basically not thinning. So you're not doing a long row of seeds and running out of your seed packet and then going back and thinning the ones that you don't want. It saves gardeners effort. He estimated it's about 2% of the work because you don't need to dig once you've got your box set up. You don't need to rototill. It saves gardeners tools. You don't need any big, heavy tools. You basically just need a trowel to add more compost or soil when one crop is harvested and you're planting another one. it takes up a lot less space, about 80% less space than traditional row gardening, because you're using basically all of the space in your square feet. Square foot gardening saves gardeners water. It's estimated that you use about 75 to 80% less water by just watering by hand or using drip irrigation. And it costs a lot less, about 50% less. You're using about 80% less seeds because you're actually just putting in the number that you need, maybe 2 or 3 per hole, but no more than that. And as far as yield, you get about at least twice as much produce in less than half the space. The square foot method allows you to plant an average of about 8 plants per square, meaning that you can grow about 130 plants in a 4 foot by 4 foot block. And it's fun for all ages. So the first question is, how do you start? First, you need to choose a spot with these features. You want a spot with good drainage that gets at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sun daily. It should be close to your house so it's convenient to get to and you're spending the time that you need to with it. Shouldn't be too close to shrubs and trees to avoid roots and too much shade. And then you build a box. So you start by gathering your materials. Lumber, again, untreated, cedar, pine, or fir. You'll need weed cloth and or hardware cloth to fit inside the bottom of your bed. Soil, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And you want to water it in thirds when you're adding. As Pam pointed out, you don't want it to just hydroplane, stay on the top. You want it to go all the way through. Oops. You will need grids. In this picture, you can see they're building the box, and in the next picture, you're going to see the grids that they put on it. The grids can be slats or lath or string or old Venetian blinds, anything that will divide your box into equal squares. You want to gather some plastic pipes if you plan to do some tenting so that you can cover your box. And fencing or trellises for the sides. So as Pam pointed out, you can grow spreading vegetables vertically. Support materials such as netting or mesh, shade cloth. And finally, the tools that you need, like a drill, screws, etc. Your box can be 4 by 4 or longer. As I mentioned earlier, the two that we built are 4 by 6. You really want to be able to get around it easily, and anything over 4 feet is a stretch. It can actually really be any shape you like. You could also use brick or cement blocks, vinyl or recycled plastic, whatever works for you. Okay, secondly, you want to fill your box with soil mix. And here you can see the grids on that box, on those 2 boxes. A simple soil mix that Mel came up with is easy to make at home. Please note these ingredients are in equal volumes, not by weight. So it's a 1/3 coarse grade vermiculite that's made of rock, but it's light and fluffy and keeps your soil from getting bogged down. A 1/3 of sphagnum peat moss. You can also use coconut coir. It makes the soil lighter, crumbly, helps it retain water. And finally, a 1/3 blended organic compost. If you have your own compost, that's really the best. Then how do you decide how much soil you need? I won't go through all of this because you can see it on the slideshow later. But basically, you're looking at cubic feet, which is area times depth. So a 4 by 4 by 6 inch box is going to need 8 cubic feet of soil mix. And then it goes on to tell you about how much you'll need of each one if you're filling 3 boxes of 4 by 4 by 6. And here I'm showing adding the divisions. This is Tim and Kathy and Andrew working on the tabletop square foot garden that we have in the teaching garden here in Amador County. You can, as I said, you can make the grids really inexpensively if you have old Venetian blinds or you can get wood laths sold in home improvement stores. Why a grid? Well, it lets you see clearly how to space your seeds and starts, and it also keeps your garden looking really well organized and tidy. Just real quickly again, construct the square, add soil, add the divisions. Then you're ready to start planting. So first of all, you really need to decide what you really like and how much of it you want to plant. Unlike row gardening, where people often just open the seed packet and sprinkle the seeds until the packet's empty, with square foot gardening, you control just how much you plant. You're not as tempted to plant more squares than you need. More plants than you need. And if you end up wanting more of a certain plant, like lettuce, you can always harvest squares that are ready and then replant them with more of what you want. So when you start planting, you decide what you want, then plant how many plants will fit in each square foot. You can look at the back of the seed packet, and if the instructions say 12-inch spacing, like tomatoes or peppers, you would put one plant in that square foot. If they say 6-inch spacing, then you can put 4 plants in each square foot, and that would include lettuce and others. I'll go into some of those others in a minute. If it's 4-inch spacing, then you can actually put 9 plants in each square foot, like spinach and onions. And if it's 3-inch spacing, you can fit a whopping 16 plants in that square foot, probably more than you need, radishes, carrots, etc. And here's some more. I've just given some examples here of how many plants per square foot. So bok choy, for instance, is 1. Cucumbers, you can put 2. Head lettuce, 4. Here's another example of a size chart where they've got a giant watermelon, so that's extra large, and you'd actually just put 1 plant in 2 square feet, all the way down to marigolds and corn, parsley, etc. Here's just another pictures and some more of just showing him, here's 1 plant per square foot, and you can put all these different vegetables in that 1 square foot. A broccoli, a cabbage, a tomato, an eggplant, a pepper. 4 plants per square foot. Here's some more examples. And again, just use your finger to block out where you want to plant, and you're set to put them right in. 9 plants per square foot. And 16 per square foot. And as you can see, you're not going to be wasting a lot of seeds because you might just put 1 or 2 in each one. Okay, there are hidden advantages to square foot gardening, and some of them are, one is companion planting. It's really easy in a square foot garden. Since your crops are so close together, you can include plants like onions, garlic, nasturtiums, marigolds in any part of it, and they'll be close enough to discourage pests. So you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out where to put things. They can pretty much go anywhere. Crop rotation, very important in gardening, is easy. It happens naturally as you replace a harvested crop with a new one of a different kind. Succession planting, when any of your crops are harvested, you just add a little compost to that square and you plant something else. This is a good way to have favorite crops over a period of time instead of having all your lettuce ready at once and then bolting, which often happens when you plant in rows. And finally, interplanting. Let's take peppers as an example. Since they need 12-inch spacing, you can have all that space around that pepper where you can plant a few faster growing crops that can be harvested before your pepper needs all of its room. So you might tuck in a few radishes around that pepper and then harvest them before you're even ready to harvest your pepper. Okay, then you want to add fencing or trellises, and Pam went over this in more depth, but in a square foot garden, it's the same principle. You want all your things like squash and melons, cucumbers, tomatoes, they take up a lot of space, but they can easily be grown in your square foot garden by adding fencing or trellises, thereby saving a lot of space, provides more sunlight and air circulation, and reduces damage from pests. It also makes it easier on those of you who might have back problems being able to harvest while you're standing up. And these are just some different examples of trellises. Okay, this one on the left is our wonderful Master Gardener Coordinator, Tracy Celio's trellis. It's called Livestock Wire, and you can get it at Tractor Supply. She said this panel was about $90. She simply bent the edges between two raised beds and then trellised edibles on it. Last year, she had a sun gold tomato and scarlet runner beans, and she said it was gorgeous. And this year, she's thinking of purple yard-long beans. It's cheap and easy. And here's one that would use on the right, the plastic piping I talked about a little bit earlier. Here's one that you can use to cover your square foot garden to keep pests out of it. And then on the right, it's a little hard to see, but you can actually build your raised garden, your square foot garden with different levels. And this one has like a little upper level on it, as well as a trellis in the back. Okay, I've just done a review here of you're making your garden in squares, not rows. You can build the boxes like we've done, bottomless, and just put in new soil, or you can put plywood on the bottom as we did in the teaching garden to make a tabletop garden. You want to space them about 3 feet apart so that you've got walking aisles between them. And then again, fill them with the special soil mix, or you can just put in soil. I mean, it's not required that you use the special soil mix, but it is recommended. And then make a square foot grid for the top of each box. That's a must. Be sure you never walk on your growing soil, which if it's in a box, you probably won't. Tend it from the aisles. And then plant a different flower, vegetable, or herb crop in each square foot using the packets, what they say on the back for spacing. Conserve the seeds. Again, just plant just a pinch, 2 or 3 seeds, or even 1 or 2 in each hole. And that way you can just trim off the one that you don't want. And then water by hand or drip irrigation system. And when you finish harvesting a square foot, add compost and replace it with another crop. And remember, it's less work. So happy gardening. They're just some sources of where I found the information. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay, so now it's time for questions. Lori, would you like to start asking questions that were in the chat?
Thank you. You were locking me from unmuting there. Okay, first of all, I just posted that the PowerPoint will be presented early next week for those of you asking for the links, you'll find them there. Okay, question from Lorena Ramos. Should a pond liner be used at the edges of the raised beds to preserve the wood?
You could, but I'm not sure what the pond liner is made up of. If there are chemicals in that might leach into the soil. So I might check and see what it consists of before I'd use it.
Okay, and that kind of segues into another one. We do recommend that, hang on a second here, let me find, homeowners do their own research and do what works best for them. Master gardeners share UC science-based resources. There was a post about hardware cloth and cancer. So do your own research and make your own decisions there. Lauren Michelle Schottman, should I seal liquid rubber, Waterloo, or stain the wood for the raised beds for longer lasting beds?
I wouldn't, because again, you don't know what chemicals are in those, and again, it could leach into the wood. Betty, what do you think?
I would say the same thing. They really encourage you to use untreated, and then if you're putting something on that, you don't really know what's in it unless you investigate.
And the wood holds up fairly well. I noticed some people had asked about using cement blocks or concrete blocks, and that's another way to go too. That wouldn't, in the teaching garden, that's what they've used. So that would be another way if you're concerned about the wood rotting quickly.
And I've had several raised beds, and they've been there. They haven't been treated with anything, and they've been fine for about 6 years.
Okay, Tracy Hansen has a question. Can you address the best methods to avoid animal intrusion like deer? That's the first question. And can I container garden herbs or spices that are deer resistant and don't need to be fenced? So 2 questions there.
I think a container garden would be great for herbs. You can keep it closer to your, kitchen door or back door. So I think that would be fine. And Betty, you probably deal with deer. I don't have any deer where I am.
We actually have a fence all around our property, so the deer stay out. We're more, we have 3 huskies, and they also keep the the turkeys away and so forth. But the main problem we have is with raccoons, squirrels. Something got into mine, even though it was covered, and ate some of my winter vegetables.
Yeah, I noticed this is a little bit smaller animal, but somebody else had asked about cats. And I have indoor cats, but there's a neighbor cat that just loves my yard and always uses it as their private bathroom. And I've tried chicken wire, but then you have stuff growing through it. It's hard to get it out. I've tried netting. I've tried a shade cloth, which in the summer is kind of nice because the shade cloth helps protect the plants a little bit. But you just have to see what's going to work best in your particular raised bed. It's frustrating. So I noticed with the hardware cloth, if I tack it on the bottom rather than bring it up on the inside, then they can't get through. So that might help.
Okay, Jeannie O, what can be used to fill the bottom of large containers such as half wine barrels when growing plants that don't have deep roots?
I've used all sorts of things. I've even used like old soda cans, put those in the bottom. Probably some rocks, just things that aren't going to hurt the soil. You don't want to put something in that's going to leach into the soil. But and then again, when I did my my large raised bed, I put straw in the bottom.
And could I add on that too?
Sure.
Wood. If you've got a void at the bottom that you just want to fill and you've got some rotten wood, it's great because it'll take a long time to rot, and it'll hold water, and the roots will find that wood and attach itself to that wood. And I'm assuming this is untreated, unpainted wood, just natural wood that's you would otherwise be having a burn pile to get rid of. So you can hide it.
Thanks, Ed. That's a good idea.
Okay, here's a good one I think might apply to everybody. What is the minimum depth of the box to allow for root growth? And I think this is square foot gardening they're asking about.
Well, you really need to look at figure out how deep those roots are going to go. Like some plants have really, really deep roots. And so if they're hitting clay after they get through the soil, it's going to make it difficult for them to grow. That's partly why I decided to do mine at 16 inches as opposed to 8 inches. Some plants don't need as much root space, but that would be something you'd want to investigate.
Okay. How do you keep your larger plants like tomatoes and watermelon contained in their square foot?
Oh, so really important to have them go up a trellis or some kind of a fence. And as Pam pointed out, you can put slings, so you can use mesh or add things to the trellis so that as they grow, they're moving right up the trellis and not spreading all over your garden and taking up all the space.
Okay, and there was a question, can the beds be put on a slope? Would they still work? Well,
I imagine I imagine they could. I think it'd be better if you tried to level it out a little bit at least.
I can answer that one, believe it or not. I have square foot gardens on a slope,
Ooh.
and you just have to be careful to make sure that you water from the top going down. Otherwise, you drown the bottom and you never get the top watered. So water from top down and level it out in your 3x3 or 4x4 squares. Make sure it's sort of like little steps as you go down.
So terracing kind of, right?
Yeah, kind of like terracing.
Okay.
If the raised beds get hot during the summer, is the sunshade advised while the slope gets, while the starts get established?
I think it would be a good idea. You don't want them burning. Usually the starts are started earlier in the year where it's not that hot, but I know I've had better luck if I've put some shade, even, you know, an umbrella or some shade cloth over, like say tomatoes when it's really, really hot in the summer. Betty, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. And it's actually pretty easy to build something that will hold that shade cloth. Like you can use PVC pipe and put it over your bed, or just put a trellis and have it. I just stuck 4 posts into the ground around my bed and just put cloth right over that. And then I can move it really easily. Or that one slide that I had where he had a movable enclosure to put over his square foot garden. You could put shade cloth over that when you need it and then just pick it up. It's really light, easy to make.
Well, and to add on to that, the ultraviolet up here is so strong because we're at a higher altitude that a shade cloth really does help a lot.
Yeah, we have one in the teaching garden in Amador County, and it's really important because otherwise those little plants do get fried with the heat.
And especially if you have it in a raised bed or even with the concrete blocks, those are going to get even hotter. So you kind of depend on what you're growing it in. And containers really heat up fast.
Okay, well, that kind of segues into another question. How do you measure the moisture level for most vegetables? How much is too wet or how little is too dry?
It depends.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, I stick my finger in it, and if it's, or you can also take the soil. If the soil is, if you put it in your hand and you squish it together and it just sticks together like a big block of mud, you're probably putting too much water. If it just completely falls apart, not enough. And you have to look at your plants too and see how they seem to be holding up.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I just stick my finger in it, or I have one of those a little moisture monitor that you can stick in, and it tells you how much moisture, if it's too dry or too wet.
Okay, next, is it okay to use black plastic to keep down the weeds?
I don't think, I'm not sure if you mean underneath or on top, but if you're using it underneath, I don't think the water would be able to go through. So you're going to have a big buildup of water. As far as black plastic on the top, again, that's up to you. Because there are chemicals in the plastic. So that's kind of your decision.
If you want to kill weeds with the plastic, clear plastic is better. It solarizes.
Okay. Do you line the bottom with rocks or pebbles for drainage?
I don't. Everything, the roots will go around the rocks and plug up the hole anyway. So I haven't done that. Betty,
Yeah.
do you?
No.
Okay. With a raised bed or raised bed square foot garden, what is the best way to set up drip irrigation? 1 to each square?
Well, with a square foot garden, you could just run a line that goes between the squares and kind of catches all of them. We've got, in my 4x6, we have just two drip lines that go, and it catches all of them. They just go down the middle.
And with my containers, I have drip on those, and you can adjust the drip to be more or less. So it depends if it's a smaller pot, you won't need as much water going in as if it's a larger one. So you can get adjustable drips on that.
Okay, regarding filler for voids and pots, can you use branches from pruning? Does it matter if the branches are freshly pruned?
Ed, what do you think on that one?
You just want to cut them small so that they lay down, not sticking out of the ground. And they'll rot, everything will rot. So you're just trying to fill the gap. I wouldn't worry about if they were fresh or old.
Yeah, that'd be a good way to use that
Take
up.
5 years from now and you'll see that it's nicely starting to rot and got roots really attached to it.
Ed, you did a raised bed where you had a lot of branches and things underneath the soil, isn't that right?
Yeah.
What was the name of that method? Start with an H?
It's borrowed from the concept of hugelkultur.
Mhm.
Don't ask me to spell it, okay? I can look at it. It's a German word.
Yeah, Ed, can you stick that name in the chat so everybody can pick it up?
Yeah, I gotta go look up the spelling.
Okay, if using cinder block for square foot gardening, do you need something marking the square foot, or can you use chalk marks on the block?
My only concern would be that the chalk marks might wash off. If you're using cinder block, you could just use string. I mean, really anything that keeps those square, keep those square. When I first did a square foot garden, I thought, oh, I don't need to put, string or slats or lats or anything. I'm just going to use my hand and just kind of mark them out. Well, pretty soon it wasn't clear at all where the square feet were. So I think it might be hard to see if you're just using chalk.
Yeah. String works really, really well.
Cheap, easy, you can move it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, this person lives in the Pacific Northwest, but at what temperature would you need a shade cloth? I think we can answer locally, but go ahead.
I would think locally, any time it's going to be sustained over maybe 100 degrees. We get sometimes several days of 105, and for sure I'd use shade cloth then.
Okay, you mentioned you purchased your soil from a landscape seller so you could choose your mix of soil that you wanted. What mix do you usually purchase?
It's hard to tell you exactly what mix because they're all different. Where I went, he had about 3 different levels. He had just basic soil, then he had soil with a certain percentage of compost, and then soil with a little more compost. So you could kind of decide what you wanted. I kind of probably like about a half and half. You don't want soil that has too much sand in it because then everything's just going to drain, the water just drain through. You don't want that has too much clay because the water will stay there. Betty, what recommendations do you have?
I did the same thing. I went to probably the same one you're talking about. He had 3 or 4 different types of soil. And I actually asked the person there, because he's kind of, an expert with soil, what would be best for a raised bed. And it was something with a certain percentage of, I think, turkey compost. They have some that are better for growing other things. But he said he basically told me which one was a good all around all-purpose for growing organic vegetables. Yeah,
So
so there are a number of places around here that you can go, and usually the people that are there are pretty knowledgeable. But something certainly with a good amount of organic material in it. And then I do supplement. We have a small vineyard, and so we found that when we harvested the grapes, and we have all the grape, the grape skins and the grape just everything that's left over, we put it into an old raised bed and just left it there, and it turned into wonderful, wonderful compost. So we've been using that. And then I also have worms. So I've put in some of the worm casings with the soil and just added that to it. So anything you can add to whatever you have, that, especially if you're making your own compost, just add that to whatever you get.
Okay, we may have covered this, but can landscape fabric be used to line the raised bed?
As long as the water can permeate through it, yes, I think that's what I've used in the past.
Okay. Is redwood good for boxes?
I think so.
It's
It's
untreated.
excellent, but it's not cheap.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where fir and pine, just untreated.
The red part of the redwood and the red part of cedar has got chemicals built up in the sap that are rot resistant. The white part is known as the sapwood, does not have those features. So if you had a piece of redwood that was like a little bit of sapwood on it, I would position the sapwood to be on the outside and the red part to be on the inside.
Okay.
So you'll get less rotting on the stuff that's contact to the dirt.
Okay, I'm assuming this applies to raised beds, what we're talking about. My husband plants tomatoes every year in the same planting area. Does anything need to be done to replenish the nutrients, minerals in the soil? Their tomato production has dropped year by year.
Ooh,
The
yeah,
first thing I think is you shouldn't plant tomatoes in the same place year after year,
right.
because it depletes the soil of certain nutrients. So you need to rotate your crops, basically.
Absolutely.
And I'm not sure which, is it nitrogen that's good for tomatoes, or that just makes the leaves grow? Anybody, Ed, do you have any? Or Maureen?
Definitely nitrogen.
Okay.
And I had a major problem last year. My tomatoes just looked horrible, and I'd rotated everything. So I started adding some phosphorus because it looked like they were low in phosphorus. It really, it would be a good idea to try and check and see what your soil has. Usually the nitrogen gets depleted every year, so that usually has to be added every year. But potassium, phosphorus, you need to have a balance of all those. So I would check your soil and see, but definitely rotate those crops because they will deplete the soil and you won't get much.
Well, and one question to this point is, if you can't rotate your crops, like I have containers that my tomatoes live in, what about planting a cover crop during the winter, like peas or beans, one of the legumes to help fortify the soil, and then till that under before you plant your tomatoes? Would that help?
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. Fava beans are really great for that. Yeah, till it under, and then if you can rotate. If you can't, definitely replenish that soil.
Okay, what is the minimum depth of soil suggested for container planting?
Again, it depends what you're going to plant. If you're just planting, flowers, you're not going to need a real depth. If you're going to be planting carrots, something like that, you're going to need more. It just really depends on what you are putting in the planter or in the container.
Okay, can we use wood chips as the base of raised beds?
I think as long as they're not treated, again, they'd be like Ed was talking about, they would decompose after time, and that would add to your soil.
Okay. When you're not able to share the unused seeds, can you preserve them for next year's harvest?
Yes. I've heard of seeds that 10 years later were still viable. You just want to be sure that you're storing them carefully. You don't want them in a place that's humid. You don't want them in a place that's too hot. I was told I had some that I saved from last year, and I saved them in a plastic bag, and that probably wasn't good because they're not germinating. You can always check the germination the following year by putting some on a damp paper towel and seeing how many germinate. But if you, for instance, putting them in an envelope and keeping them in a place that's dry and doesn't get too hot, they should last you for a couple of years.
Okay, what are your thoughts on fruit trees in containers?
As long as your container is large enough. I know a lot of people grow their citrus in containers so that they can bring them in under cover and keep them from getting frostbitten. Just make sure your container is large enough, and then you have to make sure it stays watered enough too, because again, it will get hotter in the container.
Yeah, we have a Meyer lemon and an orange tree, and they're both in large half wine barrels. And we didn't think they would work up here, but we've gotten fruit off of both of them. So it is possible to do that.
Okay, how come when I plant potatoes, they come out the size of a marble? I don't get any big ones. I plant in a planter, but have not had any luck.
I've only done potatoes a few times, and they were kind of small. Has Ed or Doris, hey, Maureen, have you grown any potatoes?
I grew them in Washington State, so
Okay.
I haven't tried growing them here.
I think you have to feed them a lot. You have to really give them a lot of nitrogen.
Doris, is that something we could look up and then let this person know?
Sure.
Okay, I have a couple questions that are not specifically about container garden, I don't think, but let's see if we have some answers here. I had a problem with large green worms on my cabbage. What can I use to avoid them?
Post the IPM pest note in the chat for that question.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. There's a lot of good questions out there. How about any tips for growing zucchini? The zucchini on my plants always grow to a couple of inches, then shrivel up.
I didn't have much luck with the zucchini last year. The year before, I had lots of zucchini. I haven't had a problem with them not growing any longer though. Do they need to be pollinated? I'm kind of stumped on this one. Doris, is this something we could also?
Sure, we can look it up and get back to that person with specifics, but usually my experience has been it's inadequate pollination. And I have actually gone so far as to hand pollinate my zucchinis, and that seems to work. That seems to give me a better yield.
Oh.
Oftentimes when zucchini are small and then they start rotting at the ends, that's blossom end rot. And so I've posted a link in the chat to ERIC, the vegetable resource information at UC Davis, that will be helpful to growing zucchini.
Thanks, Tracy.
Okay, what is the best way to test soil nutrients, and how often do you want to test soil?
I had our soil tested by a university. Many universities do that a few years ago, and you just you take a number of like about 12 different samples from around your garden, so you can do it that way, just to get sort of a baseline. And then also sometimes these little well, no, that only works with pH. Yeah, that's the only way I've done it before, is testing it, having it tested by a university lab.
Okay. The other questions are more general, and I'm going to let Tracy or somebody else get back to people on that. Does anyone have any more specific questions about the topic of today? Container gardening, square foot gardening? raised bed gardening. Going once, going twice. Oh, wait a minute. Do you have strategies for how to plant? Oh, here we go. I got part of a question here. Plant something. Andrea, what was the rest of that question? Oh, for
Three sisters.
the three sisters. Yeah.
I
Betty,
tried, I used to teach 5th grade and we used to try that. And you plant the corn and then you plant the beans so they can grow up the corn stalk. And then you plant the zucchini or squash around it to kind of shade the bean plants until they come up. That's how I've done it in the past.
And we've done it several times in the teaching garden here in Amador. And the first year, the corn grew so high that it hit up against the shade cloth. So the next year we tried doing it with shorter corn, and the corn didn't get very high before I planted the beans, which then took over. These long purple potted beans completely took over, and the squash, the squash never did. I think it got eaten by pests. But yeah, basically you start with the corn, and then once that's about 3-4 inches high, so it has a, it started, then you can plant the beans around those, and then you plant the squash last. And the whole point is that the corn grows tall, the beans go around the corn, so that's their trellis. And then when the squash grows, it's like shade all around the bottom of the three sisters.
okay, I said going once, going twice, and you guys have gone wild here. Okay. How about, can you tell us more about the straw you used at the bottom of the raised bed? How do you know it isn't treated? How much do you put down?
Okay, you can ask when you purchase it if it's been treated, and then make sure it's straw, not hay. And then I think I put about, because it was an 18-inch high bed, or was it 24? Anyway, I put about 1/3 of the way up. I used the straw, and then I put compost, my own not completely finished compost on top of that, and then the soil. So, but there are people who do hay bale, or straw bale, I'm sorry, straw bale gardening as well. So you probably could put more straw in there if you wanted to.
Yeah, in fact, there's a straw bale in the teaching garden in Amador. If you come by, John Weimer does the straw bale gardening. And last year it had just enormous cucumbers. It was really amazing, just growing in that straw bale.
Okay, let's see here. I don't know if you can help with this, Betty. How would you suggest installing a seating bench around the sides for students?
Oh, Pam might know, because you mentioned the seating bench, I guess.
If you're going to do seating bench, you could put the board around the sides, but then I would do some sort of support underneath as well. Maybe kind of a triangle shape underneath on the corners and maybe in the middle. Because with kids, if you're going to be doing it for kids, they're going to be jumping up and down on it as well.
Yeah.
So I would do the board, but I would also put some supports under it.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're supposed to use potting mix, but we already have a big bag of planting soil. What do we need to do to it to use in container gardening for veggies?
So you have potting mix. No, you have, okay, repeat that again, please.
They have potting mix. We're supposed to use potting mix. They have a big bag of planting soil. So do they need to do anything to it to use it in container gardening?
You might, I don't know that you necessarily need to, but you might add some perlite, because I think that helps retain water. If you want to just kind of lighten it up. Betty, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I'd look and see exactly what's in the planting mix, what they've got. But any kind of planting mix always benefits from having organic material in it. So if you have any compost at home that you could add to it, or worm casings, that would certainly help. Yeah, that's what I would do.
In the chat, I've posted a UC recipe for exactly that question. And so you'll add either peat moss, 1 part perlite or vermiculite, compost, and then aged manure to that bag of soil. And that's going to get you exactly what you want.
Excellent.
Okay, how do you keep the soil at the bottom of the bed from getting very compacted?
Well, if you've done, used some of the suggestions, like putting, like Ed mentioned, putting wood in the bottom, and then Pam mentioned straw. So you've got materials that are going to decompose over time, and that should really help from keeping it from getting compacted.
Yeah, you can also, you can till it up, but I know a lot of master gardeners, at least in our group, are kind of going toward the no-till method of gardening. So that might not be something you want to do.
If you have a healthy soil, you'll have a lot of life in the soil, and therefore they break up the soil, all the critters.
Right, because there's an enormous amount going on in that soil that we don't see with all the little microbes. And that's to till or not to till. I know for years we tilled our garden all the time, and then we started trying to back away from that just to give the microbes a chance to really do their job. Also in the square foot gardening, if you're, every time you harvest something, add a little compost. So you're constantly replenishing the soil. Every time you harvest something, you put a little bit of compost in and add something else. So it's constantly getting replenished.
And you can do that with the raised beds as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we are at 10 o'clock. This is going to be our last question, and I apologize that we didn't get to everybody. Does a raised bed need to be aerated?
That kind of gets back again to whether are you going to till or not till. The only time I would maybe aerate is if it does that hydrophobic where the water just stays on the top, then you need to kind of get in there and move that soil around and get it all moistened again. But I've never just gone in and aerated it.
Yeah. And if the microbes, if you're leaving them to do their job, they're gonna keep it aerated for sure.
Okay. Like I said, I think we're going to stop the questions now. We're at the end of our time. Thank you all for some really great questions. And Boris, who's next?
Me.
Okay, take it away, Ed. Okay.
Thank you so much for attending our presentation about making the most of your gardening space today. Remember that this presentation will be posted on our website early next week if you should want to review it. Also, there will be information from previous presentations there, so it's worth taking a look. You might find another topic that you're interested in. So happy gardening.
Thanks, everyone.
And Pam and Betty, if you'll just hang tight, we'll do a quick recap after our guests have gone home for the day.